New Mexico Territory, autumn of 1876. The sun was sinking low over the desert plains, bleeding the sky in crimson and gold, as the prairie winds howled through the brittle grass. Dust swirled like smoke across the dry earth, and the creak of a lonely windmill echoed across the silence. Out here, 50 miles from the nearest town, there was only one man to witness the dying day: Samuel Avery, a rancher by necessity, a loner by circumstance. His frame was wiry, shoulders bent from years of toil, his face weathered and lined by sun and sorrow. The cattle he once dreamed of raising were gone, sold off after hard winters and harder debts. All he had left was a small house of timber and stone, and the silence of the desert pressing in around him. But that silence shattered with a sound that did not belong to the prairie, a cry. Thin, pained, human. Samuel froze, his calloused hand tightening on the worn stock of his rifle. He followed the sound toward the creek bed at the edge of his land, boots crunching against dry gravel. The fading light revealed a shape crumpled near the water's edge. It was a boy, no older than 12, his body torn with cuts, his chest rising in shallow, desperate breaths. Arrows had grazed him, blood staining his torn buckskin shirt. Samuel's heart lurched when he saw the dark braids, the bronze skin, the markings of his people. Apache. A wounded Apache child on a white man's land meant trouble. The kind of trouble that brought fire and steel down on anyone unlucky enough to be caught in its path. Every instinct told Samuel to turn back, to let the desert finish what it had started. But the boy's eyes flickered open, pleading, wordless, and raw with fear. For the first time in years, Samuel felt something stir inside him. A choice, one that would change everything before the next sunrise. But before we continue, make sure to like and subscribe for more untold Wild West stories. The desert night came on swift, as it always did, bringing with it a sharp cold that cut through the skin like a knife. Samuel Avery carried the boy in his arms, boots sinking into the sandy earth as he made his way back toward the cabin. The boy weighed little more than a sack of grain, yet Samuel felt the burden settle heavier with every step, not on his back, but in his soul. He had no kin, no family, no ties left in the world. And yet here he was, cradling a dying child who could bring down the wrath of two peoples upon him. Inside the cabin, lamplight flickered against rough-hewn walls. Samuel laid the boy down on his narrow bed, the mattress stuffed with straw and patched hides. The wounds were ugly, deep gashes across the shoulder, blood drying black around the ribs where an arrow had grazed bone. Samuel gritted his teeth, fetched his water bucket, and tore strips of cloth from an old shirt. He worked in silence, hands steady, though his mind stormed with doubts. "Don't die on me, boy," he muttered under his breath, as if the child could hear. "Not in my house, not on my land." The boy stirred faintly, eyes half-lidded, whispering something Samuel could not understand. The tongue was Apache, sharp and musical, foreign to the rancher's ears. Samuel dipped a rag into cool water and pressed it against the boy's burning skin. He'd once patched his own wounds after bar fights, after ranch work gone wrong, but never like this. Never for someone who wasn't his own blood. The night dragged on. Coyotes howled in the distance, their cries mingling with the rustle of prairie grass. Samuel sat vigil at the boy's side, every creak of the timbers reminding him how far he was from safety. He knew what would come. If the Apache found one of their children inside a white man's home, they'd call it kidnapping, or worse. And if the townsfolk discovered he was hiding an Apache under his roof, they'd brand him a traitor. Either way, Samuel Avery was marked. By dawn, the boy's fever broke. He slept deeply, breath steadier now. Samuel stood by the window, staring out at the pale horizon. The land stretched endless and barren, but he saw shadows that weren't their riders, cresting hills, rifles in hand, coming for him. He dragged a palm over his face, weary already of a fight that hadn't even begun. Later that morning, Samuel saddled his mule and rode into town. He needed supplies, clean bandages, more lamp oil, maybe something stronger to fight infection. But the moment he stepped through the mercantile door, conversation died. Men at the counter turned their heads. A pair of women with baskets clutched their shawls tighter. The storekeeper, a stout fellow with thinning hair, gave him a long look. "Morning, Avery," the the man said slowly, suspicion lacing his voice. "Heard some talk last night. Folks say you've been seen carrying something out by the creek." Samuel met his gaze evenly. "A calf," he lied. "Got tangled in barbed wire. Near tore its hide off." The storekeeper grunted, but the lie fell heavy in the air. Rumors were faster than the wind out here. Samuel gathered what he needed, paid in coin, and felt the weight of every eye on his back as he left. By the time he reached his cabin again, he knew word would spread farther than he could outrun. Back at the ranch, the boy was awake. He sat propped weakly against the wall, eyes sharp despite his frailty. Samuel crouched down, held out a tin cup of water. The boy hesitated, then drank in small gulps, never looking away. There was fear there, but also defiance, the kind that didn't bend even in the face of death. Samuel exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. "Guess you're staying a while," he murmured. That night, as the fire crackled low, Samuel thought of leaving the boy outside, letting fate take him back. It would have been easier, cleaner. But when the wind rattled the shutters, and the boy let out a soft, broken cough, Samuel knew the choice was already made. He had stepped onto a path that had no way back. Some men found themselves shackled by debt, others by law. Samuel Avery's chains were forged in that moment by mercy, by responsibility, by the stubborn will to keep one small soul alive. Whatever storm was coming, he'd have to face it head on. And out there, beyond the horizon, the storm was already rising. The weeks that followed weighed on Samuel Avery heavier than any winter he had endured. The boy Tahu, as Samuel later learned when he could speak a few words, was healing slowly. But word had already spread across the plains, faster than any rider, carried on whispers, and sharpened by prejudice. It began with silence. The blacksmith, who once traded nails for Samuel's hides, no longer raised a hand in greeting when their paths crossed. At the mercantile, the women who bought flour and molasses drew their children close when Samuel entered. The storekeeper now wrapped Samuel's goods tighter, like touching the same paper might taint him. No one said it plain at first, but their eyes told the story. He was the man who brought an Apache into his home. One afternoon, Samuel hitched his mule outside the saloon to buy a sack of feed. When he stepped back into the sunlight, 3 ranch hands leaned against the rail, their spurs glinting. One of them, a tall, raw-boned man with a scar across his jaw, spat in the dust at Samuel's boots. "Word is, Avery," he drawled, "you're keeping yourself some Indian boy. What's the plan? Raise him like your own? Or maybe sell him off once he's fattened up?" Laughter followed, mean and sharp. Samuel didn't answer. He cinched his mule's lead, eyes on the horizon, but the man shoved a boot against the rail, blocking his path. "Folks died fightin' Apaches, Avery, my brother among 'em. You handin' one of theirs a warm bed is like spittin' on graves." Samuel's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice low. "That boy's half dead. Didn't seem right to leave him for the buzzards." The man's lip curled. "Buzzards are too good for 'em. Less." The tension hung like a noose until Samuel finally stepped off the boardwalk, leading his mule away. He could feel their eyes burning into his back all the way down the street. Back at the ranch, he said nothing of it to Tahu. The boy had begun to walk short distances, leaning against the wall for support. His dark eyes followed Samuel's every move, studying, measuring. Though no words passed between them beyond the simplest gestures, there was an unspoken understanding in the silence. But outside those walls, the pressure mounted. The sheriff came calling one evening, his hat low, his voice careful but edged. "Sam," he said, standing in the doorway, "you're stirring up trouble. Men in town are angry. They think you're harboring a threat. You keep that boy here, you're inviting blood on your own doorstep." Samuel leaned on the jamb, tired eyes fixed on the sheriff. "He's just a child. Can't barely lift his own hand, much less a rifle. Doesn't matter. To them, he's Apache. That's all they need to know." The sheriff's gaze softened for a flicker of a moment. "I can't protect you if it comes to a head." Samuel gave no answer, but after the sheriff rode off, he sat long into the night, watching the fire die down to embers. He had chosen this path when he carried the boy from the creek, but now it felt like walking a ridge, where one wrong step meant a fall he might not climb back from. Days later, the threat turned real. At dawn, Samuel found a crude warning nailed to his gatepost. A dead crow, wings outstretched, its beak split open, tied with twine. Beneath it, scrawled into the wood, a single word: traitor. His stomach turned cold. He pulled the crow down, buried it beneath a stone, and said nothing to Tahu. But that night, while the boy slept, Samuel sat at the table with his rifle across his knees, eyes fixed on the window. The prairie wind howled like voices outside. He knew then the town wasn't going to leave him be. Yet the boy had no one else. Samuel thought of Tahu's hollow eyes when he first found him by the creek. If he turned him out now, the desert or the town, or worse, his own people misunderstanding would finish him. Samuel had lost too much in his own life to abandon another soul. Still, the weight of the town's fury bore down, and Samuel knew it was only a matter of time before their whispers turned into torches. The prairie had a way of testing a man's grit, and Samuel Avery, whether ready or not, was already on trial. The wind carried a different sound now across the Avery ranch, lighter, softer. Not the heavy footfall of horsemen or the harsh laughter of men in town, but the quiet shuffle of a boy learning how to walk again. Tahu's steps were uneven, but each day they grew steadier. Samuel often found him outside by the corral, his hand gripping the fence rail, his gaze fixed on the wide horizon as though searching for something or someone lost to him. Samuel didn't ask. He wasn't a man for many words, and the boy wasn't ready to give them. Still, a fragile bond began to form in the silence between them. At supper, they shared stew from the same pot, eating slowly by the glow of the lantern. The boy kept his eyes down at first, but when Samuel pushed the last chunk of meat into his bowl with the wooden spoon, Tahu lifted his gaze. For a moment, their eyes met, not master and dependent, not white man and Apache, but two souls bound by circumstance, both knowing the taste of hunger, both knowing what it meant to be left behind. One evening, as the fire snapped low, Samuel noticed the boy tracing lines into the dirt floor with a stick, circles, then a jagged mountain shape. Finally, Tahu tapped his chest, then the mountain, then let the stick drop. His face hardened with the kind of sorrow Samuel had seen in the mirror too many times. "You lost folk there?" Samuel asked quietly, though he doubted the boy understood all his words. Tahu didn't answer with speech. He just gave the faintest nod. Samuel leaned back, staring at the flame. He remembered another night, years ago, when he'd buried his wife under the cottonwoods by the river. She died of fever, and there hadn't been a doctor within 100 miles. He'd dug the grave himself, the sky black with storm clouds, the earth heavy with rain. He hadn't spoken of her in years, not to a soul. But now, with the boy watching him, he found himself saying it aloud. "My Mary," he whispered. "She's gone too. Long time now." Tahu's eyes softened, and for the first time, Samuel felt the distance between them narrow. Days grew into weeks. The boy grew stronger. Samuel taught him how to hold the reins of the mule, how to carry a bucket of water without spilling it, how to mend a fence with wire and nails. At first, Tahu's hands trembled, but he was quick to learn, his movements sharp and precise. When he failed, Samuel only nodded and showed him again. One morning, while Samuel split wood by the shed, he heard a sound he hadn't heard in years: laughter. It was short, sudden, but real. He turned and saw Tahu chasing a stray chicken that had escaped the coop, his bare feet kicking up dust, his face lit with boyish delight. Samuel felt something stir deep in his chest, an ache he had buried long ago. He didn't laugh himself, but a faint smile tugged at the corner of his weathered mouth. At night, when the prairie was quiet and the coyotes sang in the distance, Samuel found himself speaking more. Not much, just pieces of his story. The hard winters, the cattle lost to drought, the friends buried under stones with no names. He spoke because the silence no longer felt like a shield, it felt like a wall that needed breaking. And though Tahu rarely replied, he listened with an intensity that made the cabin feel less empty. One night, Tahu finally offered something in return. He spoke in halting English, words broken but clear enough. "Father, gone. Mother, gone." His voice cracked on the last word. Samuel's throat tightened. He didn't know what comfort to give, so he did the only thing he could, placed a rough, calloused hand on the boy's shoulder. The gesture was small, but Tahu leaned into it, and in that moment, it was enough. The prairie was harsh, merciless, but within those four walls, something stubborn and fragile was taking root. Not family, not yet, but trust. And in a land where trust was rarer than rain, it was worth more than gold. Still, Samuel knew it couldn't last untouched. The town's hatred hadn't cooled, and the Apaches beyond the horizon hadn't forgotten. The quiet bond he was building was the calm before the storm, the kind of calm a man could lose himself in if he forgot what was coming. For now, though, in the stillness of firelight and the quiet sound of steady breathing, Samuel Avery allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the boy's laughter could carry them through whatever waited beyond the next sunrise. The night it came, the sky was heavy with clouds, the kind that swallowed the stars whole. Samuel Avery sat by the hearth, oil lamp flickering low, rifle across his knees as always. Tahu slept on the cot, breath steady, his face at last free of fever. The rancher let his eyelids lower for just a moment, lulled by the crackle of the fire. Then the sound hit him, hooves, not one, not 10 scores of them, rolling like thunder across the plain. Samuel jerked upright, every nerve in his body tightening. He crossed the room in 3 strides, peered through the window slit. Out there, in the shifting dark, torches bobbed like a sea of angry fireflies. Riders, hundreds of them. His gut turned to ice. Apache. The boy stirred, sitting up as if he sensed it too. His eyes widened, then darted to Samuel's. Fear and recognition blazed in them. "They've come for you," Samuel muttered. "And maybe for me too." Red. He doused the lamp, grabbed his rifle, and moved to the door. Outside, the ground shook under the hooves of nearly 200 warriors, their faces painted, their cries carrying on the wind. They encircled the ranch in silence, broken only by the stamping of horses. Samuel's chest tightened at the sight, so many against one man. He glanced back at Tahu, who now stood trembling but upright, his small fists clenched. From the circle rode a figure, a chief, tall and grim, feathers trailing from his hair, a rifle across his back. His horse snorted, pawing the dirt as he lifted his voice. "You?" he shouted in broken English. "You have stolen our child." Samuel stepped onto the porch, rifle lowered but ready, his voice steady though his heart pounded like a drum. "He wasn't stolen. He was dying. I saved him." The chief's eyes narrowed. A ripple of anger moved through the warriors. Arrows were lifted, bows drawn. Samuel could feel the weight of death hanging over him like a storm cloud about to break. Behind him, Tahu's voice rang out. It was the first time Samuel had heard it so strong. The boy shouted words in his own tongue, fierce and rapid, his eyes locked on the chief. The riders shifted uneasily, listening. The chief barked a reply, sharp and commanding. Tahu answered with all the force his thin body could muster. Samuel couldn't understand, but he knew what was happening. The boy was pleading for him, defending him. The standoff stretched taut as a drawn bowstring. Sweat trickled down Samuel's neck as he waited for the first arrow to fly. Then, like lightning striking dry earth, it came. A single shot cracked the silence, not from the Apaches, but from the ridge beyond the pasture. Gunfire. White men. Samuel spun, horror filling his chest. The town. They had come, rifles spitting flame from the hilltop, bullets whistling down into the gathered warriors. Horses screamed, men shouted, chaos erupted. The Apaches returned fire, their torches flaring bright as the circle broke into a storm of war. Samuel dove for cover, dragging Tahu down with him as lead tore through the cabin walls. Splinters showered the floor. The boy pressed close, trembling. Samuel's mind raced. If the Apaches thought he had led the townsmen to them, they'd kill him and the boy alike. If the townsfolk overran the ranch, they'd shoot Tahu without hesitation. Trapped between two fires, Samuel made his choice. He kicked the door open, leveled his rifle, and fired not at the Apaches, not at the boy's people, but at the ridge where the town's gunmen crouched. One man toppled backward, his rifle clattering down the rocks. "Damn fools!" Samuel roared into the night, his voice nearly swallowed by the storm. "You'll get us all killed." For a moment, Both sides froze, stunned by his defiance. Then the chief barked another command, and the warriors surged forward, surrounding the cabin tighter, shielding Tahu with their bodies as if realizing the truth. The townsmen fired again, but this time the Apaches returned the volley with a fury that sent the hilltop into retreat. The white men broke, horses scrambling, leaving only smoke and echoes behind. When the gunfire died, silence settled heavy on the ranch once more. The chief dismounted, walked up to Samuel where he stood with his rifle lowered. His eyes were sharp, unreadable. Tahu stepped forward, speaking quickly in their tongue. The chief listened, then turned back to Samuel. "You stood for him," the chief said at last, his English rough but clear. "Against your own mun." Samuel said nothing, only nodded once. His chest heaved with exhaustion. The chief studied him long, then gave a single grave nod. "By sunrise we go. You live because he asks it." The warriors melted back into the darkness like smoke. Only the trampled earth remained, scarred by hooves and blood. Samuel sank onto the porch step, the rifle across his knees, the boy leaning against his side. He had survived the night, but the cost of mercy was carved into the land now, and Samuel knew it was far from over. The prairie was still again. Smoke clung low to the earth, torches snuffed out, hoofprints gouged deep into the dust. Samuel Avery sat on the porch with his rifle across his knees, the weight of it heavier than iron, though no shot remained in its chamber. Beside him, Tahu leaned against his side, small chest rising and falling, his dark eyes fixed on the horizon where the last riders had vanished. The boy said nothing, and neither did Samuel. Words seemed useless in the wake of such a storm. The land bore scars of the night, the splintered posts, the trampled earth, the holes in the cabin walls where lead had torn through. But the silence that followed was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of something ending, and something else just beginning. When the first gray light of dawn stretched across the desert, Samuel stood, stiff and sore, and laid a calloused hand on the boy's shoulder. "We're still here," he said quietly, as much to himself as to Tahu. The boy looked up at him, nodded once, and in that small gesture Samuel saw the truth. They had crossed a line together. Whatever came now, neither would walk alone. The days that followed were not easy. The townsfolk never came back to help, nor did the Apaches return with vengeance. Samuel rebuilt his fences one rail at a time, patched the holes in his walls with rough planks, and sowed oats into the thin soil, his back bent under the sun. Tahu worked beside him, first clumsy, then steady, his hands quick with tools, his frame gaining strength. In the evenings, when the air turned cool and coyotes sang in the distance, they sat by the fire, the glow washing over two faces carved from hardship but no longer strangers. Seasons turned, and 6 months later, the ranch stood different. Where once the grass lay barren, a crop now rippled in the wind. The barn roof, patched with cedar shingles, gleamed under the sun, and in the cabin, the silence that once gnawed at Samuel's bones had been replaced with the sound of another voice, soft, sometimes broken, but growing more certain in English with each passing day. One evening, as the sun bled orange over the hills, Tahu handed Samuel something he had carved from a piece of cedar. It was rough, uneven, but the shape was clear, a small horse, head bowed, legs sturdy. The boy pressed it into Samuel's hand, eyes searching his face. "For you," Tahu said, the words halting but proud. Samuel turned the figure in his palm, thumb brushing the edges. He felt his throat tighten, but he only nodded, slipping the carving into his pocket as if it were the most precious thing he owned. By then, even the town had begun to shift. Folks still muttered when Samuel came in for supplies, but the open hostility had cooled. A few men, seeing the crops rise green on his once barren land, offered curt nods. The blacksmith, who hadn't spoken to him in months, finally raised a hand one morning in greeting. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely, but respect, grudging and slow, had begun to take root, same as the oats in his field. The sheriff, riding by one afternoon, dismounted and stood with Samuel at the fence line. His eyes traveled over the ranch, then to Tahu, working with a hammer at the barn door. "You kept him," the sheriff said. Samuel's jaw tightened. "Wasn't a choice." "That The sheriff nodded, silence stretching between them. At last he tipped his hat. Maybe it was the only choice worth making. When winter came, the two of them weathered it together. The snows pressed down hard, but the fire never failed. On the beam above the hearth, Samuel took a knife and etched two names his own, and Tahu's side by side. It wasn't blood, but it was bond enough, carved into the heart of the home. By spring, the boy's laughter was no longer rare. He ran along the pasture fence, chasing the mule with bare feet kicking up dust, and sometimes Samuel caught himself standing still, watching with a quiet smile he never would have believed he had left in him. The land was still harsh, the world still cruel, but mercy had given him something he thought was gone forever: purpose. Samuel Avery, once a man broken by loss and solitude, now found himself bound to another life. One he hadn't asked for, but one he could not imagine letting go. The prairie had tested him with fire and fury, and in saving one boy, he had saved a piece of himself. And so the ranch stood scarred, stubborn, alive like its owner, like the boy he had chosen to shelter. Out here, survival was never promised, but dignity, honor, and the stubborn courage to stand for mercy that was the true legacy Samuel left behind. If this story touched your heart, ride with us again across the untold trails of the Wild West. Don't forget to subscribe to keep the fire of these stories alive.